In our study so far of the Kena Upanishad and Sri Aurobindo's commentary on it, we have been studying the chapter number 8, in which Sri Aurobindo is commenting on the concept of sight of our sight, hearing of our hearing, which the Kena is pointing to, and which the Kena says is Brahman. And as the first part of this discussion, Sri Aurobindo brought us to the recognition that sense is not primarily the result of our physical organs. It is essentially mental contact with an object, and in that mental contact there is the reproduction of an image. So when you look at a flower, the mind turning to the flower is the experience of the sense. Otherwise, until there, the biology is working mechanically. Light shining on the retina is the same light shining on the wall. But it does not produce in the wall the sense, although there is an impact, although there is an effect. It is in us also when mind sees that we say we have a sense. But in that first seeing, there is also a taking in and a form given in the mind by the mind. Mind does not know the flower as it is originally, it only knows its idea of flower. So this mental contact with an object and the mental reproduction of its image, this is the essence of the sense experience. And now Sri Aurobindo goes deeper into the whole operation of the mind, and this is important for us to understand, to go deep enough into what the Kena is pointing to. We could at this point say, oh, there is a superior sense and that's it. But the Kena, as any of the early Upanishads, is very precise, very profound, even in the tiniest suggestion. It is not speaking of a general sense. It is not speaking of something which is greater than mind, which uses mind, and therefore a general sense. It is speaking of sight and hearing. And Sri Aurobindo explains later, it picks these two because these are the two subtlest of our five senses. And if these two of these have their equivalent of a sight of our sight and hearing of our hearing, then there is in the higher consciousness an equivalent experience of seeing and hearing, which is not just mind entering in contact generally. There's something very specific to the experience of sight which belongs to the Brahman consciousness, of which our sight is a limited expression, and the same with the hearing, and the same with the five senses. And in that discussion, which will be in the next chapter, he will also reveal to us why we have five senses and not six and not four. It's a very interesting discussion, but it goes very deep. And as a first step to this deeper understanding, he shows us what is the operation of the mental consciousness or active consciousness generally, which is involved in the sense perception. What is its equivalent operation in a higher supramental consciousness? What is the relationship between these two? In understanding this, we will understand also in what way that higher perception of the higher consciousness in the five senses is reflected in the lower consciousness, in its lower perception, in its five senses. So we are moving towards this deeper understanding. And as a first step, he says, all active consciousness, and of course mind specifically, has four necessary functions which are indispensable to it. Whenever, wherever and however it may act. Now this is, of course, these four functions are required only when there is action. When there is no action, the consciousness can turn into itself and remain lost in itself. But when there is action, it has to engage with things, then there are four functions which are necessary. And this is true of all consciousness. So it is true equally of the mind as of supermind. It is also true of lower than mind and emotional consciousness or purely sensory consciousness also. It is even happening at a subconscious level. These four functions will be present everywhere. And what he shows us, and we read that part last time, we will just review the portion we read last time. Of these four functions, two of them are spontaneously operating in the mind as it currently functions. The other two are not spontaneously operating, they have not yet been organized. And so mind as if tries to get those functions through the working of the intellect. Those two functions properly belong to the supermind, where they are spontaneously operative. But since mind does not have those two functions spontaneously operative, it has to organize by an effort of a concentrated intellect, which is trying as if to replicate that higher operation here in mind. And so through the intellect, the mind is trying to reach up to supermind and access its working in these inferior terms. And then he explains, to the extent that this higher working, which the intellect is trying to imitate, to the extent that that higher working begins to act in the intellect and through the intellect, we have the phenomenon of genius. But eventually its completion is when the full action of the supermind in its free action becomes now directly accessible and works through the mind directly. So these four are extremely important to understand. We have read that paragraph also, but we have not perhaps fully assimilated the deeper, I will say, experiential character of these four functions. The names may be a little confusing because they are Sanskrit terms: Vijnana, Prajnana, Samjnana and Ajnana. And for those who are not aware of the deeper sense of the Sanskrit terms, the terms can be very confusing. They are all jnana, jnana, and with some variation in the front. But Vijnana, you will recall, is the original comprehensive consciousness which holds an image of things at once in its essence, its totality, and its parts and its properties. It is the original, spontaneous, true, and complete view which belongs properly to the supermind. And this is not organized in our mind. This is Vijnana. And Vijnana, you will remember, is the term used in the Veda for the supermind. But here he is describing it as a function, a special function operative in consciousness, which is native and free and complete, properly only in a consciousness of unity in supermind. Here in our intellect, the intellect has to struggle to replicate the function of Vijnana by going through a whole process. We will see examples of that shortly. The fourth one is Ajnana, which Sri Aurobindo describes as the operation by which consciousness dwells on an image of things so as to hold, govern and possess it in power. This also is fully operational only in the Vijnana, in the supramental consciousness, and the intellect tries to imitate and get it to work in us. So let's take a quick example of this. When you are cycling, you may be chatting with somebody, you may even pull out a mobile phone and speak. And at that point, all your attention is on the conversation. You're barely conscious of your surroundings. You're totally unconscious of the movement of your legs or even your hands and the way you keep the balance. And yet, you're able to keep the balance and even navigate to where you are going almost effortlessly. This sense of seizing, possessing, owning the cycle becoming an instrument of you, as a part of you, as an expression of your consciousness, effortlessly, is the sense of ajnana. The dwelling on an image of things so as to hold, govern and possess it in consciousness. You hold the cycle in your consciousness when you sit on it, You govern it and you possess in the power of your expression. At some point, somebody may say, oh, you have to change the direction. You only intend to change the direction, your hands follow, your legs follow, and the whole mechanism of the balancing is automatically flowing effortlessly. In the supramental consciousness, all experience of things is as spontaneous and as easy in the governing, holding, possessing, and governing in power. What you wish to do, you do spontaneously, effortlessly, as easily as you turned the direction of your bicycle. Or even when we are walking, we are not conscious of how the feet and the toes are constantly moving to keep the balance accurate. And if perchance we trip on a stone, momentarily the mind's attention is pulled because there is an urgency, the body pulls it, but the recovery of the balance is not done by mind. Mind is unable at that point to stop and think, should I swing my right hand to balance the fall of my left? Should I move the left leg a little left or right? You don't have time to think. There is instantly, spontaneously a correction taking place in the body. You are only vigilant because of the shock of the body calling your attention, but the correction is done by the body, effortlessly. Well, not as effortlessly as when we are walking, but there is an instinct pushing. It knows exactly what needs to be done. And it does it. So this whole action of the balancing and the corrective of the balance is also the closest that we experience in our body, daily life experience of the character of ajnana. The vijnana aspect is sensed on a more subtle level, and it's not so obvious in the way the mind works. In cases when a person has complete forgetfulness of memory, and now there are many movies which have popularized this illness, where somebody wakes up in the morning with no memory of what has happened in the last whole of his life, and everything begins afresh. I believe there is a movie which is called 40 Dates or something like that, where this young man is in love with a woman who has this loss of memory, and every day he has to begin afresh his whole attempt to woo her. Every day she starts with, who are you? Why are you bothering me? Although they have had a very nice romance ongoing for many months or years. But every day it's a fresh start, everything is lost, everything is forgotten, and you have to go through the whole exercise. But although everything is forgotten in terms of information and memory, you notice implied in the functioning of the person is the idea that I am a person, others are people, that the world is the way it is, that there are houses, there are roads, there are birds. You look at a bird, perhaps you do not remember having seen the bird before, but you know it's a bird. You may not know the word bird, but you still know the thing for what it is. A newborn baby, supposedly having had no programming of knowledge, information, of world experience, and on the first act of opening his eyes or reaching out through the senses, sees things and accepts them for what they are. And if it is shown something which is abnormal, he feels uncomfortable. All of this implies that something inside our consciousness knows it all, not consciously, behind, above, somewhere hidden, unknown to us, unconscious to us, but perhaps superconscious to itself. It knows the whole world and how things should be. And if somehow I see a person hanging upside down, the child looks and gets afraid, because that's abnormal. And there's something that knows that this is not a normal thing. When something falls, we are not surprised. We know that the world is like this, falling is normal. And so there is a part in us which already knows everything. Because it already knows everything, therefore the other two functions organized in the intellectual mind are able to have their operations. Seen from the highest perspective, that's why Sri Aurobindo says, Vijnana is the original, spontaneous and true and complete view. Because everything else derives from it. Because that is there, these other things are possible. And now we come to the two functions which belong properly to the current organization of the intellect, prajnana and samjnana. Now again, if we look at the sense of the Sanskrit root, pra, which puts forward, projects in front. That's the sense of pra. Knowledge projecting in front. Sam, the root is of including, of all, of completing. So, prajnana is the consciousness of apprehension which reaches out to possess its object in conscious memory, energy. Samjnana is the in-bringing movement of the apprehensive consciousness which draws the object placed before it back to itself, so as to possess it in conscious substance, to feel it. So when I see the flower, familiar, I know flower. This is the samjnana part which I feel familiar with. It belongs to me, it is somewhere in me. I feel what it means to be a flower. But if I lived in a desert and for the first time I stepped into a space where there was water and flowers, there would be complete surprise. What is this flower? And after a while, when I have lived there long enough, the flower experience would be so much a part of me that as I would walk into a garden, I might not even notice it. Oh yeah, that's flower. It's already there in me. But at first, when we meet something completely new, there is a gap, there is a separation. And so there is the reaching out first of the prajnana. What is this? And then you see the instinct to reach out and touch. Because it's following the instinct of the mind. The mind is reaching out and then to take in. But the reaching out action Sri Aurobindo describes as the consciousness which holds an image of things before it as an object, with which it has to enter into relation and to possess by apprehension, and a combined analytic and synthetic cognition. So I see this, I first feel myself separate from it. It's the first time in my life I've stepped out of the desert, I see the flower. What is this? I am separate, that is separate. Does it bite? Is it harmful? Is it dangerous? And then there is an action of the mind quickly, taking up similarities, separating, analyzing, synthesizing, and comes to a quick conclusion. Oh yes, I have read about these things. This must be a flower. And then I'm trying to reach out because now I feel it is safe. Let me smell it. And I'm trying to take it in through all my five senses. Touch, smell, taste perhaps not always, but secondarily through smell. And of course the visual sight. And I may play with the variation of the flowers for a while. Eventually though it becomes a part of me by the act of the samjnana which brings it in possession in its substance. And the ajnana instinct of mastering, possessing, governing, that is acting through, subtly, trying to get familiar, trying to know, trying to become an expert in the field of flowers. And somebody in the domain of intellect who has reached that mastery, a master botanist, will walk into a garden and say, this flower, it is this type, it is this species, it normally grows in this climate, and here right now it seems to be not having enough water. Or the soil is slightly acid, therefore the color is red or blue, and if it is more alkaline, it will be the other color. He knows all this. And if he has to arrange a garden or create a garden, knows exactly where to place what in right relation, so that the flowers and the plants nourish each other, protect each other, and so on. But you see, this ajnana operation is still different from the experience of cycling, which was spontaneous. Here the mind has to act, to analyze, to observe, to place, to rearrange. And if I have to create a garden where I want to create a microclimate, I will start thinking, I must put the larger plants on the outside so that they act as a natural barrier from the wind. I must put the most delicate plants in the center, therefore near to it must be a water stream. And I will start thinking and putting together, and this is the way the intellect imitates the free working of the ajnana, spontaneity of power. When you're cycling, you're not thinking like this, that you need to put more pressure on the left or right or turn the handle here or there. It happens. And a person living in the ajnana free, in the supramental consciousness, would see and know spontaneously how the garden has to be created and expressed. But the intellect has to play out, arrange, and then it finds, oh, this is not fitting, or this is conflicting. Move it around, move it there. You will remember the incident of mother saying, put the pillar there, because it was obvious. It's like that. But here the intellect naturally has the power of prajnana, reaching out, samjnana, drawing in, but ajnana is clumsy. Vijnana, putting in the full context, completeness of knowledge on all levels, clumsy. And so we need to study books, practice our skill, and over time the power of vijnana and ajnana, knowledge and power, the complete knowledge and the mastery of power, they develop gradually, bit by bit, accumulated, developed through experience, until in the master of whatever the skill is, of the knowledge or the art, the master seems to do things so spontaneously. And the acolyte is looking at him and saying, wow, how did you do that? How did you know that? You did it so easily, I would have to think 10 times before I got it. Because he has come to some degree of higher functioning where the true faculty of vijnana and ajnana in the supermind are now beginning to reflect through the intuitive influence into his higher intellectual working with the subject. But until that comes, the means by which that is being developed is the current operation of prajnana, reaching out, analyzing, synthesizing, and then samjnana, drawing in to become familiar and to make a part of it, of oneself in substance, possess in substance. So we see these operations now in another example. When you go out as a child, you see people cycling, you wonder at their skill in balancing. And one day you're old enough and your parents say, now here is a cycle, you're going to learn. And so first you reach out tentatively, you hold the handle and you struggle. And at that point, there is the quick action of the prajnana and sanjnana, cycle known, but the operation of cycle is not known. And in the act of holding, in the act of moving, there is the prajnana, samjnana happening repeatedly, trying to take in bit by bit the pieces of the cycling experience. And as the pieces are being accumulated, they are being arranged, all taking place behind the scenes somewhere. And through this repeated movement of the operation of prajnana and samjnana, which we are not consciously doing, which are happening automatically, the mind uses these two to accumulate a bundle of knowledge, experience, mastery, which it is organizing, rearranging, organizing and rearranging again and again. So you see the act of seeing and taking in, which is happening automatically in the current development of intellect, is followed by the second act of arranging and somehow trying to assimilate and gain control and power. And this is what Sri Aurobindo says in the text we had read last time. As it is, what happens is a rapid process by which we sense an image and have of it an apprehensive percept and concept, and a slower process of the intellect by which we try to comprehend and possess it. And the comprehending and possessing of the bicycle takes me several days or weeks, until one day it has got reasonably stable that I can actually begin to cycle around, and I'm so happy I get distracted and suddenly there is a car honking loudly and I brake in shock, in reaction, because I don't know what to do. And so repeated series of experiences widen this very narrow base of constructed apprehension, of constructed comprehension and possession, which widens with more and more complex experience. Until a time comes when I may even be able to, while cycling, let go of both handles and still maintain the balance. If I try to think it out, I will not be able to do it. But if I let my body flow, it seems to happen spontaneously. I tap into some kind of an intuition through the body. And the intuition acts and through the body knows how to keep the balance, and I can leave my hands and keep the balance still. And there I say, now I have got a real mastery. The bicycle is an extension of my body. It's a part of me. So these two functions which intellect has to construct and accumulate over time are not spontaneous. And all of our learning experience is primarily based on these two construction processes of the intellect. The first two functions are happening automatically. And that's why you will see in a child often, especially in the early years, let's say till the age of 12, before you get into some kind of formal abstract learning, you only need to give the child real life experiences and he absorbs quickly. The vocabulary of a new language, the child gets automatically. He never has to make an effort to learn because the samgyana and the prajnana, the prajnana and samgyana, taking in, making ours is happening automatically in any lived experience. And because the language instinct has already been developed to the inner consciousness, the mastery of language, which comes with the vijnana and ajnana faculties, is quickly taking place behind, almost automatically. But when the same child enters a technical field, now I enter engineering or history of art, and there's a whole vocabulary and a complexity involved, there the intellect has to kick in and start learning and constructing. So I think with these examples, we have now a better idea of these four functions. So just as in the mind two are developed, in the supermind the other two are fully free, if we go below mind, there is a consciousness in which these two which are developed in mind are not so developed. In the experience of a plant or a worm, the power of prajnana and samgyana are not as developed as in the human mind. And therefore you will find when a worm is crawling, you put your finger in front, it touches, it backs off. It hesitates, it moves around trying to go elsewhere. And if it again meets the same thing second time, it moves but with less violent reaction. Again tries to move around, you put your finger again, it meets it this time, tentatively touches it a few times, and then starts crawling over your finger. There is not the spontaneous recognition and the taking in. There is a hesitation even in that initial process. But after a repeated series of contacts, it accepts, and if it does that sufficient number of times, it will feel it comfortable, now it is familiar. So the operation of prajnana and samgyana there you can see are there, but they are unorganized as in the human mind, they are still hesitant. And so evolution through the gradations of consciousness has brought our mind to a stage where prajnana and samgyana, reaching out and taking in an overall apprehensive consciousness, has been developed as an automatic functioning. And now evolution is struggling to reach beyond, to develop the vijnana and the ajnana, the full completeness of the knowledge, the original true and complete view, and the ajnana, which is the governing, possessing and power. These two it is trying to organize by imitation in the same hesitating tendency which you see in the worm when it is trying to explore its world. And in the more developed human being, that has become almost an automatic process to organize, has become automatic. And that's where we say, a well-developed intellect, he quickly understands, quickly learns, quickly arranges his experience and makes sense of it. But the true completion is when this becomes spontaneous. And that's when he says, the intellect and intelligent will form a bridge by which the mental being is trying to establish a conscious connection with the supramental and to prepare the embodied soul for the descent into it of a supramental action. Therefore, the first process is comparatively easy, spontaneous, rapid, perfect. The second, which is this higher working, the second, slow, labored, imperfect. In proportion as the intellectual action becomes associated with and dominated by a rudimentary supramental action, the second process also becomes more and more easy, spontaneous, rapid, and perfect. And it is this which constitutes the phenomenon of genius, in proportion as this contact is becoming more and more direct. So he says, and earlier in the paragraph, there are secret operations in us, in our subconscious and superconscious selves, which precede this whole action, and of which we are not aware in our surface being, and therefore for us they do not exist. If we knew of them, our whole conscious functioning would be changed. And in the present explorations of human science, we are beginning to glimpse these faculties and are trying to find means by which we can tap into them and make them more and more overtly active. Some examples Sri Aurobindo will give us in the next chapter, but most obviously we find that under hypnosis we are able to access things which we did not normally notice. And so something inside subliminally has noticed. Or we find that every one of us, without being conscious of it, has a capacity to sense the impending immediate future. When an image is flashed before us, just before a shocking image is shown, already in the brain there is a reaction building. And observing the brain signals, we can actually make out what the next image will be in terms of its shocking character or not. So something in the consciousness is already sensing. Can we tap that? Can we develop these possibilities? And there are efforts. One of the efforts is to simplify this whole process of vijnana and ajnana by not interfering with the conscious effort of the intellect. And either under hypnosis or under a kind of a half interiorized state which may be achieved through self-hypnosis, the mind, the activity of the intellect is brought into silence and the actual experience is allowed to just simply flow in. So the person is asked to relax and listen to a tape of a new language. And in the tape, the person is being taught what would normally be taught in a book. Instead of reading it, instead of paying attention with the intellect even to the hearing, you simply allow the sounds to flow into you while your mind remains passive and quiet. And afterwards, when you open the book and read, everything seems already familiar to you. And the learning is rapid, and what might take 2 weeks to learn could be done in half a week. And so there are experiments of this kind to change the way we learn by tapping more and more directly to a higher faculty, bypassing the intellect. These are all interesting and useful, but if we relied only on this, the development of the intellect might be limited, and therefore the instinct is also to include the intellect somehow in the whole exercise. But that is a part of a wider discussion. So now we have a clearer picture of these four faculties and their working. In any conscious interaction, all these four functions are operative. Sri Aurobindo now takes the discussion to the next level. If we suppose a supreme consciousness, master of the world, which really conducts behind the veil all the operations the mental gods attribute to themselves, it will be obvious that that consciousness will be the entire knower and Lord. So we are assuming, let's say, that there is such a consciousness which conducts behind the veil all the operations, which the mental gods attribute to themselves. Now, why does he bring in this strange vocabulary? It is in the context of the Kena Upanishad, and as we will see in the later part, in the third part, there is the whole discussion and description of gods, where the first verse goes in translation, "The eternal conquered for the gods, and in the victory of the eternal, the gods grew to greatness." This was what they saw. Ours the victory, ours the greatness. This is what the gods say. But actually it is the eternal who has conquered for them. But they say it is we who have conquered. So, verse 2, "The eternal knew their thought and appeared before them, and they knew not what was this mighty daemon." Daemon means spirit. And so, the eternal appears, they cannot recognize it. They said to Agni, "O thou who knowest all things born, learn of this thing. What may be this mighty daemon?" And he said, "So be it." Verse 4, "He rushed towards the eternal, and it said to him, 'Who art thou?' 'I am Agni,' he said. 'I am he that knows all things born.'" Verse 5. Now the eternal replies, "Since such thou art, what is the force in thee?" Agni responds, "Even all this I could burn, all that is upon the earth." Verse 6. The eternal set before him a blade of grass. "This burn." And he made towards it with all his speed, but he could not burn it. There he ceased and turned back. "I could not know of it. What might be this mighty daemon?" Verse 7. Then they said to Vayu, "O Vayu, this discern, what is this?" He said, "So be it." Verse 8. He rushed upon that. It said to him, "Who art thou?" "I am Vayu," he said, "and I am he that expands in the mother of things." Verse 9. Since such thou art, what is the force in thee? Vayu replies, "Even all this I can take for myself, all this that is upon the earth." And so on, he sets the blade of grass and Vayu cannot move it. And then the gods call Indra. And the same continues. And finally verse 12. He in the same ether came upon the woman, capital W. Even upon her who shines out in many forms, Uma, daughter of the snowy summits. To her he said, "What was this mighty daemon?" And then begins part 4, where she reveals who is this eternal. She said to him, "It is the eternal. Of the eternal is this victory, in which ye shall grow to greatness." Then alone he came to know that this was the Brahman. And so it continues. And then about the gods. So Vayu, Agni, Indra could not touch the eternal. And you see, each time the eternal asks, "What is the force in you?" It's very similar to the first section of the Kena Upanishad, which says, what is the sight within our seeing? What is the life of our life? What is it which directs the mind? What is the force inside which makes this possible? But in this part 3 and 4, the whole thing is taken to the level of the gods. In their cosmic operations, the powers that act in the cosmos. And there are all the gods, but they put forward from them these three: Agni, Vayu and Indra. And the full import of this we will understand later. And these being their principal means to reach out, literally like our senses to reach out and to know, all the gods put forward these three as their senses to know. When it reaches the eternal, it cannot. Just as our senses cannot know Brahman. And in counter, the eternal asks, what is the force in you? And they do not recognize that in them is his force, which makes their action possible. And so, not recognizing it, they cannot do anything to the blade of grass that he puts forward. And then there is Uma, daughter of the snowy summits, who reveals to them who is this eternal. And this is the mother who, as power of the eternal and as mother of the gods, shows them the way and puts them in touch with their source. And it is his victory because he acts through you. You think you are doing it, but it is he who is doing it through you. And all this is happening at the level of the gods of the cosmic powers. And of course, the same thing happens in us. So in the text of the Kena Upanishad, all that we have been studying at our level of human level is then replicated on the higher level, but now meaning something far more profound with a far deeper understanding. And some of this we will understand as we proceed in Sri Aurobindo's commentary. But when you have this big picture, now you can understand why Sri Aurobindo now introduces this new vocabulary of the gods. So, if we suppose a supreme consciousness, a master of the world, which really conducts behind the veil all the operations the mental gods attribute to themselves. Now suddenly this makes so much more sense once we have read that. The gods think it is they who are doing the function, but behind them even is this supreme consciousness. It will be obvious that that consciousness will be the entire knower and Lord, which even the gods do not have. They do not have the entire knowledge and the entire lordship. They have the knowledge of their function and the lordship of their function. Agni can burn, Vayu can expand to the whole universe. So it is mighty, it is cosmic, and yet it can only expand. It cannot know the eternal, because it does not know its own force is not its own, it belongs to that. So, now we understand this reference to the mental gods. And the idea that this supreme consciousness is even beyond that. That will be the entire knower and the Lord, capital K, capital L. Because that knowing is of a different character altogether, that lordship is of a different character. So Sri Aurobindo continues, the basis of its action or government of the world will be the perfect, original, and all-possessing Vijnana and Ajnana. Vijnana being the knowledge aspect, Ajnana being the lordship, power aspect. It will comprehend all things in its energy of conscious knowledge, control all things in its energy of conscious power. So there are two things which are being presented to us constantly, the knowledge and the power. It will comprehend all things in its energy of conscious knowledge. So its knowledge is all-inclusive, embraces everything, includes everything in its totality and in its energy, meaning it is in an action of knowledge, knowing with full energy. Not a passive knowledge in abstraction, but a dynamic, energetic, full, possessing knowledge. And at the same time, it controls all things in its energy of conscious power. So as it knows, it acts in all things at the same time. These energies will be the spontaneous, inherent action of its conscious being, creative and possessive of the forms of the universe. So, the description now goes deeper. The action of that consciousness of mastery will be spontaneous, inherent, meaning it does not have to make an effort to do. It is in the knowledge itself that the power exists. In the power, the knowledge exists spontaneously of its conscious being, creative and possessive of the forms of the universe. So all these power of knowledge and action are of its being, and it creates and it possesses all that it creates. So the equivalent experience will be for us of the way our consciousness knows itself and possesses itself, or knows our body and possesses our body. If at this point we choose to become conscious of our right hand, we are aware instantly. We do not need to raise it and say, let me look, and now I know. The identity is there in consciousness, the awareness is there, and now we want to move our hand, we move it. We do not say, now let me initiate the movement, and then the movement will go through many steps. And yet when we want to move the flower, we have to move our hand, which moves a stem, which grabs a stem, which pulls and moves. There's a whole indirect process. If you want to lift a heavy stone, you are sitting in a crane, you push the lever turns the motor pulls the string which lifts the stone. But in the consciousness of that, the action is spontaneous, inherent to itself, and it creates and possesses all the form of the universe and all the forms within it. If this be the case, we see the complete action of Vijnana and Ajnana, full knowledge, full power. Where are the other two? Samjnana and Pragyana. What part then will be left for the apprehensive consciousness and the sense? And doesn't then that conscious experience sense, perceiving? So you are conscious of your right hand, you can move it, but you can also bring it before you. You can see it. So there is an act of making it appear as if it is separate from you, although it is you still. So this is what Sri Aurobindo explains. They will not be independent functions but subordinate operations, involved in the action of the comprehensive consciousness itself. So you still have the comprehensive consciousness, your hand, my hand, I am hand, and still I can objectify it and become aware, oh, my hand is like this. It feels warm, I know it already from inside, and I know it. So in our consciousness, obviously there is still a separation. Hand is not identical with me. There is still a sense of a subtle gap. But in the consciousness of the origin, it is identical with it. And yet, and the analogy here is your awareness of your own awareness. I am aware that I am conscious. And in that awareness of your own consciousness, you can objectify it and say, I am observing the quality of my consciousness, and I find that currently my thoughts are not very clear. And I can will them into clarity. And I did it spontaneously. I willed it, it became clear. And that's it. There was no movement, there was nothing in between. But still I objectified it to itself. And so for the Master of the world, for the Supreme Consciousness, it is in this way that the operations of Pragyana and Samjnana exist, as subordinate operations involved in the action of the comprehensive consciousness itself. In fact, all four there will be one rapid movement. You have full knowledge, full mastery, full awareness of all that you know, objectivized, and full taking in and identification in that objectivization. Simultaneously. In fact, all four, there will be one rapid movement. If we had all these four acting in us, with the unified rapidity with which the prajnana and samjnana act, we should then have in our notation of time some inadequate image of the unity of the supreme action of the supreme energy. This is a very interesting idea. If we could do this in our consciousness, to have all four operating at the same time, that would be some image, inadequate, of the unity of the supreme action of the supreme energy. Why? Because that is acting in a consciousness of infinity and unity, and above limitation of space, time and causality. Here we may experience that, let us say we are fully aware and fully master of our own awareness, and to some extent, let's say, of our body or our thoughts, or while we are cycling to that extent within that act, and these things are happening spontaneously, all four functions, then we might have some image in our notation of time. So again, this is a major restriction. We have in our experience the sense that time is going one after another. 1 second has passed another second. One moment is followed by another moment. The moment a moment ago is gone. I have no access to it. But to that supreme consciousness, the whole of time is laid out. Nothing has ever gone. Nothing has ever not happened. Everything is there in all its possibilities. So its notation of time, its notation of space, its sense of unity is so different that whatever we may be able to achieve, and even if by some miracle we can get all four functions at the same time, united, it would still be, he says, in our notation of time, some inadequate image of the unity of the supreme action of the supreme energy. But to think like this helps us to understand the difference, as well as these functions within us and their relation with that higher functioning. And remember, this whole paragraph started with, if we suppose a supreme consciousness master of the world, then all this would be how it should be. So in the next paragraph he says, if we consider, we shall see that this must be so. That is, if at all there is a supreme consciousness master of the world working behind the veil, this must be so. It must have this capacity. The supreme consciousness must not only comprehend and possess in its conscious being the images of things which it creates as its self-expression, but it must place them before it, always in its own being, not externally, and have a certain relation with them by the two terms of apprehensive consciousness. So even when it manifests itself, in its own consciousness there is this subordinate operation of placing before it and then relating to it. Otherwise, the universe would not take the form that it has for us. So here comes a very deep idea. We'll put it this way now in slightly different terms. When the Supreme launches itself and moves into manifestation and has this secondary operation of objectivizing itself and its forms to its consciousness, it makes possible inside the universe the objectivization of form, because he has objectivized it. And therefore, when we experience ourselves as a cut-out separate form, we participate in that layer of objectivized world experience, which the Supreme is secondarily, subordinately experiencing. For us, that becomes the only experience, because we have already put ourselves in the consciousness, identified with a separate fragment in the objectivization, and therefore we share only in that part of the Supreme's experience. And you see how in the Supreme Consciousness there is the unity first, and then there is the objectivization, observing itself as flower, itself as tree, and so on. And that is a phenomenal, secondary, subordinate experience. But inside that experience, we have appeared as a separate piece, and so we only know that experience. And that is our experience of world, of divided consciousness, divided senses, divided mind. But actually, all that we are experiencing is possible because the Supreme is experiencing it also, although as a subordinate experience. In other words, we are participating in the Supreme's experience of Himself in its subordinate, objectivized prajnana and samjnana operation. That's why in us the prajnana, samjnana is spontaneous. But we are not participating in His united consciousness, and therefore for us those two operations of vijnana and ajnana are not accessible. But they are behind. If they were not there, these two could not be possible. So in us they operate secretly from behind the veil, and because they exist, the intellect can imitate them and organize as they should, or as closely as it can of what they should. But its imitation is still operating in the divided consciousness, and so it is only at best a superior imitation or inferior imitation, but it remains an imitation. The day we are able to step out of that subordinate operation of consciousness and join with the unity of the divine consciousness, those two functions become spontaneous, true, and complete. So this vision is very important because it makes us understand where we are and the intimacy, the closeness in which that whole supramental consciousness and all its functions are present in us, working in the world, but as if behind the veil. To themselves they are not in a veil. To us there is a veil because our consciousness has created the veil of fragmentation, of separation. And we are in this subordinate layer of the experience of the universe, of the Supreme. So he says, otherwise, if it was not so, otherwise the universe would not take the form that it has for us. For we only reflect in the terms of our organization the movements of the Supreme Energy. In other words, the Supreme Energy is doing everything right here, right now. But in our term of organization, this is all that we can reflect of it and experience of it. But by the very fact that the images of things are held in front of us, are held in front of an apprehending consciousness within the comprehending conscious being and not externalized as our individual mind externalizes them, the Supreme Mind and Supreme Sense will be something quite different from our mentality and our forms of sensations. They will be terms of an entire knowledge and self-possession and not terms of an ignorance and limitation which strives to know and possess. So at this point we come back to the core discussion of this chapter. What is the relationship of our sense with the Supreme Sense, our mind with that Supreme Mind? Now we are seeing some pragyana and samjnana as a secondary operation within the larger operation of vijnana and ajnana. And so our sense operating in the domain of this divided pragyana and samjnana is a reflection of that sense, but that sense is fundamentally different, as is that mind fundamentally different. This is the point he has made. And the last paragraph of this chapter, which we will take up next time, he says, but the Upanishad is not speaking merely of the Supreme Sense. It is speaking of sight of our sight and hearing of our hearing. And so there is something deeper which we have to recognize. Now we have understood the sense operation is different. And in what way it is different. In what way our sense is a subordinate sense to that higher sense. But now why the difference of sight and hearing? And where does that distinction exist? In what way does it exist in that complete consciousness? This will be the discussion of the next chapter for which he will prepare us. So we pause here for today and review the big picture, there is the original, spontaneous, true and complete view, which properly belongs to the supermind, which is Vijnana. With it is the power to hold, govern and possess the Ajnana, complete. We may call them in English omniscience and omnipotence. These, because they exist, can be imitated at any level of organization, including in our mind by our intellect. There is in that consciousness the secondary power of prajnana, placing before to reach out, and samjnana, drawing in and possessing in substance. And these two in our current evolution of mind we have been able to develop. The other two are not overtly developed but covertly exist, permitting the intellect to imitate and then to struggle through imitation to reach out and to receive the influence of the supramental action directly. Remember, the whole effort of the intellect and intelligent will is to form a bridge, to prepare the embodied soul for the descent into it of a supramental action. So there is an effort for that higher action to penetrate into the lower, and from the lower there is this effort to reach out and create a framework and a bridge. And this is the working of the intellect and the intelligent will. And you see how important this is now. In fact, it is the means by which we make our first ascent to the higher consciousness. But it will always fall short. It can only prepare a condition in which the higher can descend and settle. And so the further phase of the conscious self-surrender, the training of the mind to become passive to a higher influence, though it must first pass through the phase of activity to develop its capacity to receive the higher influence and act freely. So we understand the whole picture of evolution more profoundly. And in this distinction of the two levels of consciousness and mind, the operation of the senses, which currently are dependent entirely on prajnana and sangyana operations. The vijnana and ajnana are not organized in our sense experience. And therefore that sense of our sense is fundamentally of a higher grade and different character. And yet we can say our sense is as if a reflection and a limited distortion, limited and distorted expression of that. And this is the point at which the picture is paused for a still deeper understanding of why there are five senses and in what way they operate there and how they are reduced here, which will be the theme of the next discussion. You see the clarity with which Sri Aurobindo brings us to this understanding, the intricacy and the subtle nuances he picks out from the Kena, which we would never have noticed if he didn't point it out and say, oh, look, this is important. And he integrates the totality of the Kena, weaves all the things together. Even as he deals with a small part, we see the relationship with the rest. And the whole text of the Kena is now seen to be one complete whole. Even though we are reading a part, his consciousness, which sees the whole, is reminding us of its relation with the complete text. And so it gives a very different understanding from what would be otherwise a merely scholastic analysis, step by step. This is what's said, and we go in a linear pattern. But the text itself is not linear, it is comprehensive. And within the comprehension of the whole, there is the operation of prajnana and samjnana with which we are grasping and organizing within us the experience. We continue next Sunday.